Everything seemed frozen and lifeless. A hostile Alaska wilderness where survival measured itself in hours, not days. But hidden beneath layers of ice and decades of silence was a truth that would transform one girl's desperate escape into an impossible discovery. 12-year-old Maya Freeman stood at the edge of the frozen lake, her breath forming ice crystals in the brutal Alaskan air. The temperature gauge on the abandoned ranger station behind her read 76 degrees, a number so extreme it felt abstract, impossible. But the ice forming in her nostrils, the burning in her lungs with each breath, the way her tears froze on her cheeks, those sensations were horrifyingly real. She had been walking for 6 hours since escaping from the Youth Wilderness Rehabilitation Camp near Fairbanks. The camp, marketed to desperate social services departments as therapeutic outdoor intervention for troubled teens, had been anything but therapeutic. Underfed kids, undertrained staff, dangerous cold weather exposure disguised as character building. Maya had watched 2 kids get frostbite severe enough to require medical evacuation before she decided that dying in the wilderness on her own terms was preferable to dying under the camp's negligent supervision. So she had run, stolen a parka, boots, gloves, and an emergency pack during the chaos of a shift change, and simply walked away into the brutal interior Alaska winter. She knew it was probably a death sentence. But at 12 years old, after 5 years in foster care following her parents' deaths in a car accident, Maya had learned that sometimes the illusion of choice was worth more than the guarantee of another day. The ranger station had appeared like a mirage after 4 hours of walking. A small wooden structure half buried in snow, clearly abandoned for the season. Maya had broken in through a window, desperate for shelter from the killing cold. Inside, she found basic supplies, dried food, emergency blankets, a propane heater with half a tank of fuel. Enough to survive for maybe a week if she was careful. But it was what she found in the storage closet that had driven her back out into the deadly cold. A journal, old and water-stained, with a note attached in recent handwriting that read, "If you're reading this, you're in trouble. There's an old research tent, too, 3 miles northeast at coordinates 64, 7835 degree N, 147, 89622 degree DW. Emergency supplies cached there. Follow the blue trail markers. RC 2019. Maya had stared at those coordinates for a long time, weighing her options. Stay in the ranger station and hope someone found her before her supplies ran out? Or risk the walk to this mysterious tent that might not even exist anymore? The decision was made easier by voices she heard outside. Adult voices shouting her name. The wilderness camp staff tracking her through the snow. If they found her, they would take her back. And Maya knew with absolute certainty that going back would break something in her that could never be repaired. So she followed the blue markers, small metal tags nailed to trees, barely visible in the endless white landscape, but present if you knew to look for them. And after 90 brutal minutes of walking through cold so extreme it felt like drowning, Maya saw it. A weathered canvas tent, white with ice accumulation, nearly invisible against the snow, except for the bright orange emergency flag tied to its support pole. If you enjoy rural mystery stories about forgotten children and shocking discoveries, like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this story will hold you from the very first moment. The tent was larger than Maya expected, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet, with a wooden floor and frame structure that had somehow survived the Alaskan winters. The entrance flap was frozen solid, and it took Maya several minutes of carefully melting the ice with her body heat before she could work it open. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak winter sunlight filtering through the canvas. But it was warmer than outside, maybe 20 degrees warmer, and Maya understood why when she saw the small wood stove in the center, its pipe extending through a careful opening in the tent roof. Someone had set this up as a semi-permanent shelter. The tent was filled with supplies, food rations in sealed containers, water purification equipment, medical supplies, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, and most intriguingly, boxes and boxes of papers, documents, photographs, equipment that looked scientific. Maya's survival instinct took over before her curiosity. She got the wood stove lit using supplies she found neatly stacked beside it, rationing the wood carefully, but allowing herself enough heat to stop the dangerous shivering that had begun during her walk. She ate an emergency ration bar, drank melted snow water that she purified, and wrapped herself in 2 of the extreme cold sleeping bags. Only then, as warmth slowly returned to her body and the immediate danger of hypothermia receded, did Maya begin to examine what was around her. The boxes of papers were labeled with dates: 1952, 1953, 1954, 1955, 1956 to 1958. Maya opened the first box carefully, her cold, stiffened fingers fumbling with the lid. Inside were journals, field research journals from something called the Arctic Research Initiative. The entries were written in careful scientific language, documenting temperature readings, wildlife observations, glacial measurements. But what caught Maya's attention was a photograph paper-clipped to the first page. It showed 5 people standing in front of this very tent, dressed in 1950s-era cold weather gear. 3 of them were black, 2 men and 1 woman, standing proudly beside 2 white colleagues. The back of the photograph was labeled, ARI Team, Winter, 1952. Dr. James Freeman, Dr. Sarah Chen, Mr. Robert Matthews, Dr. Catherine Morrison, Mr. David Chang. Maya stared at the name Freeman, her last name. She read it again, her heart beginning to race for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold or her dangerous situation. She pulled out more photographs, more documents, letters from the team to the National Science Foundation, describing their groundbreaking research on climate patterns in interior Alaska. Newspaper clippings about the first integrated Arctic research team. Personal journals filled with both scientific observations and more intimate reflections about the challenges of being black scientists in 1950s Alaska, about facing skepticism and discrimination, about proving their worth through meticulous research. And then Maya found a letter that made everything stop. It was dated December 1958, written in a shaky hand. To whoever finds this cache, my name is Dr. James Freeman. Our research team has made discoveries about Arctic climate patterns that are decades ahead of their time. But our funding has been cut. Our findings dismissed as inconclusive by colleagues who cannot accept that Negroes might contribute meaningful science. They are trying to erase our work, to take credit for our discoveries without acknowledging our contributions. I am hiding copies of our research here, in the place where we did some of our most important work. If you find this, please know that we were here. We did this work. We mattered. And if you bear my name, know that you come from people who refuse to be invisible, even in the coldest, most remote places on Earth. Dr. James Freeman, December 15th, 1958. Maya read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling from more than just the cold. Dr. James Freeman. Could this be her grandfather? Her great-grandfather. She had never known her father's family history. Her parents had died when she was 7, and no one in the foster system had cared enough to tell her about her family beyond the basics needed for paperwork. But here, in a tent at the edge of the inhabitable world, in cold that could kill in minutes, Maya had found evidence of family. Evidence that she came from scientists, from people who had done important work, from ancestors who had refused to let the world make them invisible. The sound of engines in the distance, snowmobiles, cut through her revelation. The camp staff, still searching, getting closer. Maya looked at the boxes of documents, at the decades of research and personal history, at the proof that Black scientists had been doing groundbreaking work in Alaska long before anyone acknowledged it. She looked at the letter from Dr. James Freeman, this man who might be her ancestor, who had hidden this research, hoping someone would find it and tell the truth. And Maya made a decision. She wouldn't run anymore. She wouldn't hide. She would protect this research the way Dr. Freeman had protected it 65 years ago. She would make sure their story was told. But as the snowmobile engines grew louder and adult voices shouted her name through the brutal cold, Maya realized that protecting this discovery while being a 12-year-old runaway in lethal weather conditions might be the most impossible thing she had ever attempted. She grabbed the most important documents, the letter, the photographs, several key research journals, and stuffed them inside her parka, against her body where they would be protected. Then she stepped out of the tent into the killing cold, ready to face whatever came next. But she wasn't the same girl who had run away 6 hours ago. She wasn't just Maya Freeman, throwaway foster kid. She was Maya Freeman, descendant of scientists and pioneers. And that changed everything. The wilderness camp director, a hard-faced white man named Dale Peterson, emerged from the tree line on a snowmobile, followed by 2 staff members Maya recognized from the camp. Their expressions mixed relief with anger, the kind of anger adults showed when children made them look bad. "Maya Freeman," Peterson shouted over the engine noise. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in? You could have died out here." "People were dying at your camp," Maya shouted back, her voice surprisingly steady despite the cold and fear. "2 kids got frostbite because you made them sleep in tents when it was too cold. I saw it happen." Peterson's face reddened. "Those were isolated incidents, medical situations we handled appropriately. Now get on the snowmobile before you freeze to death and create a PR nightmare for everyone involved." Maya didn't move, her hand pressed against her parka, where the documents rested against her chest. "What is this place? This tent? Why is it here?" Peterson glanced at the tent dismissively. "Old research site. Been abandoned for decades. Now stop wasting time and—" "It's not abandoned," Maya interrupted. "There are supplies, recent supplies. Someone maintains this place. And there are documents inside, historical documents about scientists who worked here in the 1950s. Something shifted in Peterson's expression, a flicker of interest or maybe concern. Historical documents? What kind of documents? Maya's survival instinct screamed warning. Peterson was too interested, asking too quickly. "Just old papers, research journals, nothing important." "If they're not important, leave them and let's go," Peterson said. But he was already dismounting from the snowmobile, moving toward the tent entrance. "No," Maya said, positioning herself between Peterson and the tent. "You can't just take things from a historical site. That's illegal." Peterson laughed, a sound without humor. "Kid, you broke out of a youth facility and stole property. You're hardly in a position to lecture anyone about legality. Now move aside or I'll move you." But before the situation could escalate, another snowmobile appeared through the trees, this one driven by a black woman in her 40s wearing National Park Service gear. She pulled up beside Peterson's vehicle and removed her helmet, her sharp eyes taking in the scene immediately. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice carrying authority, "I'm Ranger Denise Clark, Alaska Department of Natural Resources. We got a distress beacon activation from this location. Is everyone all right? Maya saw her chance. I activated it, she said quickly, which was a lie. She hadn't known there was a beacon, but the ranger didn't need to know that. I found this tent, and I think it might be a protected historical site. There are documents inside from the 1950s, research journals, scientific equipment. Ranger Clark's expression sharpened with interest. From the 1950s, can you describe what you saw? Don't listen to her, Peterson interrupted. The girl is a runaway from our wilderness program. She's confused, possibly hypothermic. We need to get her back to camp for medical evaluation. What I need, Ranger Clark said coldly, is to investigate a potential historical site on federal land, which supersedes your wilderness program concerns. She turned to Maya. Show me. Maya led her into the tent, hyper-aware of Peterson and his staff following close behind. Inside, Ranger Clark's eyes widened as she took in the boxes of documents, the photographs, the carefully preserved research materials. "My God," she whispered, carefully lifting one of the journals. "This is from the Arctic Research Initiative. I've heard stories about this project. Integrated research team, groundbreaking climate work, mysteriously shut down in the late 50s. Most of the records were supposedly lost or destroyed." "Not destroyed," Maya said quietly. "Hidden. By Dr. James Freeman. He wrote a letter explaining why." She pulled the letter from inside her parka and handed it to Ranger Clark. She read it carefully, her expression growing more serious with each line. "This is significant," she said finally. "This is documentation of both scientific research and racial discrimination in federal programs. It needs to be preserved and studied." She looked at Maya intently. "How did you find this place?" There was a note at the ranger station, with coordinates. Someone named RC from 2019 left it, saying there were emergency supplies here. Ranger Clark smiled slightly. "That was me, Denise Rachel Clark. I cache emergency supplies at various locations for lost hikers. But I had no idea this tent contained historical materials. I thought it was just an abandoned research site." "It's not just historical materials," Peterson interjected, his voice tight. "Some of that research might have significant scientific value. Climate data from the 1950s could be worth considerable money to the right parties." Ranger Clark turned to him slowly. "Mr. Peterson, are you suggesting that federal historical materials should be sold for profit?" "I'm suggesting that practical considerations—" "There are no practical considerations," Ranger Clark cut him off. "This is federal land. These are potentially significant historical documents, and they will be turned over to the appropriate authorities for preservation and study." She pulled out her radio. "I'm calling this in to the Park Service Historical Division and to the Alaska Native Heritage Center. They'll want to coordinate on documentation and preservation." While she made her calls, Peterson pulled Maya aside roughly. "Listen, kid, you and I can make a deal here. There's information in those journals that certain parties would pay good money for. Oil companies, development firms, people who need historical climate data. You help me get copies of the key documents before the bureaucrats lock everything down, and I'll make sure your time at camp gets a lot more comfortable." Maya stared at him, understanding clicking into place. "You want to steal the research, just like they tried to steal Dr. Freeman's credit in the 1950s. You want to profit off their work without acknowledging where it came from." "I want to be practical," Peterson hissed. "That research is just going to sit in some archive where nobody benefits from it. Why not put it to use?" "Oh, because it's not yours," Maya said firmly. "It belonged to Dr. James Freeman and his team. And if he was my ancestor, If I'm family, then it's definitely not yours to sell." Peterson's expression hardened. "You think being related to some dead scientist makes you special? You're a foster kid who ran away into killing cold. Nobody's going to listen to you about anything." But Ranger Clark had finished her calls and overheard the last part. "Actually, Mr. Peterson, I'm going to listen to her very carefully. Maya, you mentioned that Dr. Freeman might be your ancestor. What makes you think that?" "Same last name," Maya said, "and I never knew my father's family history. He died when I was 7, and nobody in the system ever told me anything about where we came from." Ranger Clark nodded slowly. "That's worth investigating. If you're a descendant of Dr. Freeman, you might have legitimate interest in these materials." She looked at Peterson coldly. "Unlike Mr. Peterson, who seems to have no legitimate interest at all beyond profit." "Now wait just a—" Peterson started, but Ranger Clark held up her hand. "You can wait at your camp, Mr. Peterson. Maya is coming with me to the Fairbanks Park Service office, where she'll be warm, safe, and able to give a full statement about everything that happened today, including, I suspect, some very interesting details about conditions at your wilderness program." Peterson's face went white. "You can't just take a child from my custody." "She's not in your custody. She's a runaway on federal land who activated a distress beacon and discovered a significant historical site. That makes her my responsibility until we sort out proper placement." She looked at Maya. "You willing to come with me voluntarily?" Maya nodded without hesitation. Anything was better than going back to that camp. The Fairbanks Park Service office was warm in a way that felt almost painful after hours in the brutal cold. Maya sat wrapped in emergency blankets, her fingers and toes tingling as circulation returned, while Ranger Clark made phone calls from her desk, and a paramedic checked her for frostbite and hypothermia. "You're lucky," the paramedic said, examining Maya's fingers carefully. "Minor frostbite on 2 fingertips, but nothing that won't heal completely. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Maya nodded mutely, still processing everything that had happened. Through the window of Ranger Clark's office, she could see Peterson in the waiting area, talking angrily on his phone. He kept glancing toward her with an expression that made Maya's skin crawl. "Don't worry about him," Ranger Clark said, following Maya's gaze. "I've already filed a report with the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services about conditions at his camp. They're launching an investigation, and I've contacted Child Protective Services about your placement. You're not going back there." "Where am I going?" Maya asked, the familiar anxiety rising. "Another placement. Another temporary home with people who didn't want her." "We're working on that," Ranger Clark said gently. "But first, I want to show you something." She pulled up a website on her computer and turned the screen so Maya could see. "This is the National Science Foundation's digital archive. I've been searching for information about the Arctic Research Initiative." The screen showed a page titled Lost Arctic Research Projects, 1950–1960. Under a section labeled Arctic Research Initiative, 1952–1958, there was a brief description. Integrated Research Team studying climate patterns in interior Alaska. Project terminated 1958. Records lost. Team members: Dr. James Freeman, lead climatologist; Dr. Sarah Chen, glaciologist; Mr. Robert Matthews, field technician; Dr. Catherine Morrison, biologist; Mr. David Chang, equipment specialist. "That's all the official record says," Ranger Clark explained. "But I found something else." She clicked to another page, this one from a historical society. There's a footnote in a book about black scientists in the 20th century. It mentions Dr. James Freeman briefly, says he was one of the first black climatologists to work in Arctic conditions, that his research was groundbreaking but controversial, and that he died in 1962 with most of his work unpublished and uncredited. Maya stared at the screen, at the small photograph of Dr. James Freeman, a serious-faced black man in his 40s, standing in front of scientific equipment, looking directly at the camera with quiet dignity. "Does it say anything about family?" Maya asked quietly. Ranger Clark clicked to another tab. "I found an obituary from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, dated March 1962. It says Dr. Freeman was survived by his wife, Martha Freeman, and his son, Daniel Freeman, age 12. Maya's breath caught. My father's name was Daniel. Daniel Freeman. He would have been 12 in 1962. The ranger and Maya looked at each other as the implication settled between them. "If your father was Daniel Freeman, son of Dr. James Freeman," Ranger Clark said slowly, "then you're Dr. Freeman's granddaughter. The documents you found, that letter he wrote it hoping someone in his family would find it someday. And you did." Before Maya could respond, Ranger Clark's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her expression grew serious. "Yes, she's here. When? I'll tell her." She hung up and looked at Maya. That was Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Alaska. She's the head of their Arctic Studies program. She's heard about the documents you found, and she's coming here tomorrow morning to examine them personally. She says if those research journals contain the original climate data from the 1950s, it could be invaluable for current climate change research. "Can they use it without giving Dr. Freeman credit?" Maya asked, immediately suspicious. "Not legally," Ranger Clark said, "and not ethically. If we can prove these are authentic Freeman documents, his name will be attached to any research that uses the data. That's why your family connection matters. You have standing to ensure his work is properly credited." The door to the office opened, and a woman in her 60s entered, wearing a Child Protective Services badge. Maya's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Social workers meant decisions being made about her life without her input. "Ms. Freeman?" the woman said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "My name is Carol Jenkins. I'm a supervisor with Alaska CPS. Ranger Clark called me about your situation." She sat down across from Maya. "First, I want you to know that you're safe. You're not in trouble for running away. We understand you were in a dangerous situation, and you protected yourself the best way you knew how." Maya said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Adults always started with reassurances before delivering bad news. "Second," Carol continued, "we've been investigating the wilderness camp where you were placed. We're removing all children from that facility, effective immediately, and revoking their license to operate. What you experienced there was neglect bordering on abuse, and we failed you by placing you there." The Fairbanks Park Service office was warm in a way that felt almost painful after hours in the brutal cold. Maya sat wrapped in emergency blankets, her fingers and toes tingling as circulation returned, while Ranger Clark made phone calls from her desk, and a paramedic checked her for frostbite and hypothermia. "You're lucky," the paramedic said, examining Maya's fingers carefully. "Minor frostbite on 2 fingertips, but nothing that won't heal completely. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation." Maya nodded mutely, still processing everything that had happened. Through the window of Ranger Clark's office, she could see Peterson in the waiting area, talking angrily on his phone. He kept glancing toward her with an expression that made Maya's skin crawl. "Don't worry about him," Ranger Clark said, following Maya's gaze. I've already filed a report with the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services about conditions at his camp. They're launching an investigation, and I've contacted Child Protective Services about your placement. You're not going back there." "Where am I going?" Maya asked, the familiar anxiety rising. Another placement, another temporary home with people who didn't want her. "We're working on that," Ranger Clark said gently. "But first, I want to show you something." She pulled up a website on her computer and turned the screen so Maya could see. This is the National Science Foundation's digital archive. I've been searching for information about the Arctic Research Initiative. The screen showed a page titled Lost Arctic Research Projects, 1950-1960. Under a section labeled Arctic Research Initiative, 1952-1958, there was a brief description. Integrated research team studying climate patterns in interior Alaska. Project terminated 1958, records lost. Team members: Dr. James Freeman, lead climatologist; Dr. Sarah Chen, glaciologist; Mr. Robert Matthews, field technician; Dr. Catherine Morrison, biologist; Mr. David Chang, equipment specialist. "That's all the official record says," Ranger Clark explained, "but I found something else." She clicked to another page, this one from a historical society. There's a footnote in a book about black scientists in the 20th century. It mentions Dr. James Freeman briefly, says he was one of the first black climatologists to work in Arctic conditions, that his research was groundbreaking but controversial, and that he died in 1962, with most of his work unpublished and uncredited. Maya stared at the screen, at the small photograph of Dr. James Freeman, a serious-faced black man in his 40s, standing in front of scientific equipment, looking directly at the camera with quiet dignity. "Does it say anything about family?" Maya asked quietly. Ranger Clark clicked to another tab. "I found an obituary from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, dated March 1962. It says Dr. Freeman was survived by his wife, Martha Freeman, and his son, Daniel Freeman, age 12. Maya's breath caught. "My father's name was Daniel. Daniel Freeman. He would have been 12 in 1962. The ranger and Maya looked at each other as the implication settled between them. "If your father was Daniel Freeman, son of Dr. James Freeman," Ranger Clark said slowly, "then you're Dr. Freeman's granddaughter. The documents you found, that letter he wrote it hoping someone in his family would find it someday. And you did." Before Maya could respond, Ranger Clark's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her expression grew serious. "Yes, she's here." "When?" "I'll tell her." She hung up and looked at Maya. That was Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Alaska. She's the head of their Arctic Studies program. She's heard about the documents you found, and she's coming here tomorrow morning to examine them personally. She says if those research journals contain the original climate data from the 1950s, it could be invaluable for current climate change research. "Can they use it without giving Dr. Freeman credit?" Maya asked, immediately suspicious. "Not legally," Ranger Clark said, "and not ethically. If we can prove these are authentic Freeman documents, his name will be attached to any research that uses the data. That's why your family connection matters. You have standing to ensure his work is properly credited." The door to the office opened, and a woman in her 60s entered, wearing a Child Protective Services badge. Maya's stomach clenched with familiar dread. Social workers meant decisions being made about her life without her input. "Ms. Freeman?" the woman said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "My name is Carol Jenkins. I'm a supervisor with Alaska CPS. Ranger Clark called me about your situation." She sat down across from Maya. "First, I want you to know that you're safe. You're not in trouble for running away." We understand you were in a dangerous situation, and you protected yourself the best way you knew how." Maya said nothing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Adults always started with reassurances before delivering bad news. "Second," Carol continued, "we've been investigating the wilderness camp where you were placed. We're removing all children from that facility effective immediately and revoking their license to operate. What you experienced there was neglect bordering on abuse, and we failed you by placing you there. I'm sorry." An apology from a social worker was so unexpected that Maya didn't know how to respond. "Third," Carol said, "we need to find you appropriate placement. Now, normally, that would mean another foster home or group facility. But Ranger Clark has made an unusual request, and I'm inclined to approve it." Maya looked at the ranger, who was smiling slightly. "I've offered to provide emergency foster placement for Maya," Ranger Clark said. "I'm a certified foster parent. I've had my license for 8 years. I usually take short-term placements for kids in crisis situations, and Maya's situation definitely qualifies as crisis." "You'd do that?" Maya asked, not daring to hope. "You don't even know me. I know you're intelligent, resourceful, and brave," Ranger Clark said. "I know you protected important historical documents when you could have just focused on your own survival. I know you care about truth and justice. That's enough for me to want to help." Carol pulled out paperwork. "It would be a temporary placement, probably 3 to 6 months while we work on finding something permanent. But it would give you stability while you heal from what you've been through. And it would keep you here in Fairbanks, close to the historical documents and the research that your grandfather apparently left for you to find." Maya felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first real tears since she'd run into the killing cold. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes, thank you." The next morning, Dr. Patricia Williams arrived at the Park Service office with a team of historians and archivists. She was a black woman in her 50s with warm eyes and an infectious enthusiasm for her work. When Ranger Clark brought out the documents Maya had rescued from the tent, Dr. Williams actually gasped. "These are authentic," she breathed, carefully examining one of the research journals. "The paper, the ink, the handwriting, the data recording methods, these are definitely from the 1950s. And the climate observations?" She looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. "Dr. Freeman was documenting warming patterns in the Arctic 70 years ago. He was seeing the early signs of climate change decades before the scientific community acknowledged it was happening." She read through more entries, occasionally making soft sounds of amazement. "This is extraordinary." His methodology was decades ahead of its time. The detail, the consistency of his observations, the correlations he was drawing between temperature changes and glacial retreat. This should have been published. This should have been recognized as groundbreaking work. "Why wasn't it?" Maya asked quietly. Dr. Williams looked at her with sad understanding. "Because in the 1950s, a black scientist's work wasn't taken seriously by the white scientific establishment. They found reasons to dismiss his findings, to question his methodology, to defund his research, and when he tried to preserve his work for the future, they tried to erase even that." She pulled out the letter Dr. Freeman had written, the one addressed to whoever might find his cache. But he outsmarted them. He hid copies where no one would think to look, and he wrote this letter hoping that someday someone who cared about truth would find it. She looked at Maya intently, and that someone was his granddaughter. That's not coincidence. That's legacy. "What happens to the research now?" Maya asked. "Now we digitize everything, preserve the originals in climate-controlled archives, and we publish," Dr. Williams said firmly. Every journal, every observation, every finding, properly credited to Dr. James Freeman and his team. We'll submit papers to the major climate journals. We'll present at conferences. We'll make sure the scientific community knows that a black scientist was documenting climate change in the 1950s and that his work was suppressed because of racism, not because of scientific merit. And the data itself, Ranger Clark asked, will be integrated into modern climate models, Dr. Williams said. Having baseline observations from 70 years ago will help us understand the progression of warming with much greater accuracy. This research has real scientific value today, not just historical value. A door slammed in the outer office, followed by raised voices. Peterson had returned, this time with a lawyer. "We have every right to access those documents," the lawyer was saying to the receptionist. "They were discovered on land where my client's program operates under federal permit. Your client's program is currently suspended and under investigation." Carol Jenkins interrupted, stepping out of Ranger Clark's office. "And the documents were found on federal land, making them federal property, which means you have exactly zero rights to access them." "We're prepared to file suit," the lawyer said. "File away," Dr. Williams said, emerging from the office with fire in her eyes. "I'd be happy to explain to a federal judge how your client attempted to profit from stolen scientific research conducted by black scientists whose work was systematically suppressed. I'm sure that will go very well for you." Peterson's face had gone from red to purple. "That girl had no right to take those documents." "That girl," Dr. Williams cut him off, "is Dr. James Freeman's granddaughter, which gives her more right to those documents than anyone in this room. And she didn't take them. She rescued them from being lost forever or stolen by people like you." The confrontation might have escalated further, but another figure entered the outer office, a tall black man in his 70s, moving with the careful dignity of age. He looked at Maya, and his eyes widened with recognition. "Dear God," he whispered, "you look just like Martha, just like my mother." Everyone froze. The man moved closer to Maya, his eyes shining with tears. "Are you Daniel Freeman's daughter?" Maya nodded, unable to speak. "Then I'm your uncle," the man said, his voice breaking. "My name is Thomas Freeman. I'm Daniel's brother, your father's brother. I've been looking for you for 5 years, ever since I heard about the accident. But you'd already been placed in foster care, and they told me I couldn't have custody because I lived out of state and didn't have an established relationship with you." He looked at Ranger Clark and Carol Jenkins. "I've been filing petitions, making calls, trying to get information, but the system kept telling me it was too complicated, that Maya was in appropriate care, and all this time she was being shuffled through placements that didn't want her." Carol Jenkins had the grace to look ashamed. "Mr. Freeman, I apologize. The system failed your niece and failed your family. If you're still interested in custody—" "Interested?" Thomas laughed, though it came out more like a sob. "I've been fighting for 5 years to find her. Of course I'm interested." He knelt down in front of Maya, bringing himself to her eye level. "Maya, I know you don't know me. Your father and we lost touch after he moved to Seattle. I regret that every day. But your family, you're my brother's daughter. And if you're willing, I would like to take you home, to give you a real home, with family who wants you." Bitu. Maya stared at this man who claimed to be her uncle, this stranger who somehow felt familiar. "Do you know about Dr. James Freeman? About the research?" Thomas smiled, tears streaming down his face. "I know everything. I've been trying to find my father's research for 40 years. He told me before he died that he'd hidden copies of his work somewhere safe, somewhere in Alaska where he'd done his most important research. But I never knew where. I searched, but... He looked at the documents spread across the desk. You found them. You found what I've been looking for my whole life. How did you know to come here? Ranger Clark asked. I have a Google alert set for James Freeman and Arctic research, Thomas explained. When news hit about a girl finding historical documents in the Alaska wilderness, I got on the first plane I could find. He looked back at Maya. I never imagined it would be my niece who found them. That's more than coincidence. That's meant to be. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and emotional conversations. Thomas Freeman sat with Maya in a quiet corner of the Park Service office, showing her photographs on his phone. Pictures of her father as a young man, pictures of her grandparents, pictures of family Maya had never known existed. Your grandmother Martha died in 1998, Thomas explained gently. She never stopped believing that James's research would be recognized someday. She kept copies of everything she could find, all his personal papers, photographs, correspondence. It's all in boxes in my basement in Baltimore. Why didn't anyone tell me about them? Maya asked, looking at a photograph of her father at maybe 20 years old, standing next to Thomas. They looked so alike it made her chest ache. Because Daniel, your father, he left home at 18 and never really came back, Thomas said, pain evident in his voice. He was angry about a lot of things. Angry that Dad had died without recognition for his work. Angry at the scientific community that had dismissed him. Angry at the system that had stolen from our family. He wanted to start fresh, build a life with no connection to the past. He moved to Seattle, changed his phone number, didn't stay in touch. Thomas's voice broke. I tried to find him for years. By the time I located him, he'd already died in that accident with your mother. And you were already in the system. You tried to get me? Maya asked quietly. I tried everything, Thomas said firmly. But I lived in Maryland. I was single. I worked full-time as an engineer. The system said you needed stability and established relationships, and that moving you across the country would be disruptive. They made it impossible. He took her hand. But I never stopped trying. And now, somehow, you found your way back to the family story. You found what your grandfather left behind. That means something, Maya. That means you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Carol Jenkins approached with more paperwork. Mr. Freeman, I've been making calls. Given the circumstances, Maya's discovery of family documents, her connection to your father's research, and your persistent efforts to gain custody, I'm recommending expedited kinship placement. We can begin the process immediately. How long? Thomas asked. Normally, several months. But given Maya's current situation and the failure of multiple previous placements, I can push for emergency approval within 2 weeks. She'll stay with Ranger Clark in the interim, and you can visit as often as you're able. Thomas looked at Maya. Is this what you want? To come live with me in Baltimore? I know it's far from here, and you'll be leaving everything familiar. I don't have anything familiar, Maya said honestly. I've been in 7 placements in 5 years. Nothing's ever been familiar. She looked at this man who had her father's eyes and her grandfather's determination. But family? That sounds good. That sounds really good. Dr. Williams had been quietly working with her team, photographing and cataloging every document from the tent. Now she approached with a laptop, her expression troubled. I need to show you all something, she said, pulling up a document on screen. I've been cross-referencing Dr. Freeman's research data with modern climate records. And there's a problem. A significant problem. Everyone gathered around the laptop. Dr. Williams pointed to a graph showing temperature measurements. These are Dr. Freeman's observations from 1952 through 1958. And these, she overlaid another graph, are modern measurements from the same locations. The warming trend Dr. Freeman documented has accelerated dramatically. Areas that were showing 0.2-degree increases annually in the 1950s are now showing 0.8-degree increases. Meaning what? Ranger Clark asked. Meaning climate change is progressing much faster than most current models predict, Dr. Williams said grimly. Dr. Freeman's baseline data shows that we've been underestimating the speed of warming in Arctic regions. If we'd had access to his research 70 years ago, we might have taken action sooner. Instead, his work was suppressed, and we lost decades. She looked at Maya with a mixture of sadness and determination. Your grandfather was right, and the people who dismissed his work, who cut his funding, who tried to erase his research, they didn't just commit an injustice against one black scientist. They potentially delayed action on climate change by decades. The consequences of that suppression are measurable and severe. Peterson's lawyer, who had been listening from across the room, spoke up. That's quite an accusation, Dr. Williams. Are you saying there was a deliberate conspiracy to suppress climate research? I'm saying there was systematic racism in the scientific community that dismissed the work of black scientists regardless of its merit, Dr. Williams replied coldly. Whether it was deliberate conspiracy or just pervasive prejudice, the result is the same. Important research was lost, and we're all paying the price now. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. My client wants to negotiate. He's willing to drop any claim to the documents in exchange for immunity from prosecution related to the camp conditions. Your client can negotiate with the Alaska Attorney General's office, Carol Jenkins said, but he has no leverage here. The documents were never his to claim, and the camp investigation is proceeding regardless. Peterson himself finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is all because of one girl's accusation. She's a troubled kid with a history of running away. Nobody should be taking her word over... Over what? Thomas Freeman interrupted, standing up to his full height. Over the word of adults who were supposed to protect her, but instead endangered her. Over the physical evidence of inadequate shelter and supervision. Over the testimony of other children who were also harmed. His voice grew stronger. My niece did what my father did 70 years ago. She documented the truth when people in power wanted to hide it. And just like they tried to silence my father, you're trying to discredit her. But it won't work this time. Ranger Clark stepped forward. Mr. Peterson, you and your lawyer need to leave. Now. This is a federal office, and you have no business here. Any further communication should go through official channels. As Peterson and his lawyer left, the lawyer muttered something about lawsuits and defamation. But Maya saw the defeat in Peterson's posture. He had lost, and he knew it. Dr. Williams turned back to her laptop, pulling up another document. There's something else I found. In one of Dr. Freeman's later journals from 1957, he mentions training a local Athabascan guide named Thomas Nicolai in scientific observation techniques. He writes about how Nicolai's traditional knowledge of the land combined with scientific methodology produced some of their best data. She looked up. I did some research. Thomas Nicolai's grandson, Raymond Nicolai, still lives near Fairbanks. He's a respected elder and traditional knowledge keeper. I think we should talk to him. Why? Maya asked. Because Dr. Freeman didn't work in isolation, Dr. Williams explained. He collaborated with indigenous peoples who had been observing this land for generations. Their knowledge was part of his research, but it's probably not documented in these journals because indigenous contributions were rarely formally credited in that era. If we're going to tell the complete story of this research, we need to include all the voices. The next day, Raymond Nicolai came to Ranger Clark's house where Maya was staying. He was a man in his 80s, with weathered skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. He looked at the photographs of Dr. Freeman's research team, and his face transformed with emotion. "I remember them," he said softly. "I was maybe 10, 11 years old. My grandfather brought me to their camp sometimes. The black man, Dr. Freeman, he treated my grandfather as an equal, asked him questions, wrote down his answers, credited him in his notes. That was rare for white people back then, rare for any outsider." He pulled out a worn leather pouch and carefully extracted a piece of paper, yellowed with age. "My grandfather kept this. Dr. Freeman gave it to him." The paper was a letter of acknowledgement dated 1957, formally thanking Thomas Nicolai for his contributions to the Arctic Research Initiative and stating that his traditional knowledge had been essential to the scientific validity of their findings. The white scientists who came after didn't care about our knowledge, Raymond continued. They treated us like we were primitive, like we couldn't understand science. But Dr. Freeman was different. He knew that we'd been scientists in our own way for thousands of years, observing the land, tracking changes, passing down knowledge. He respected that. Dr. Williams was photographing the letter with shaking hands. "This is important. This documents indigenous contribution to climate research in the 1950s. It proves that Dr. Freeman understood the value of traditional knowledge when the broader scientific community didn't." Raymond looked at Maya with kind eyes. "You're his granddaughter?" Maya nodded. "He would be proud of you," Raymond said simply. "He told my grandfather that he was hiding his research for his children to find. He believed his family would keep fighting for the truth, even if he couldn't. And you did. You found it, and you protected it. That takes courage." Over the following week, as Thomas Freeman stayed in Fairbanks waiting for the kinship placement to be processed, Maya learned more about her grandfather's work and its implications. Dr. Williams published a preliminary paper about the recovered research, which immediately sparked intense interest in the scientific community. News outlets picked up the story. Lost climate research from 1950s shows warming progressed faster than thought. But it was the human story that captured public attention. 12-year-old foster child discovers grandfather's suppressed research. Maya found herself at the center of a media storm she didn't want and hadn't asked for. Thomas helped her navigate it. "You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to," he said. "But if you choose to tell your story, you'll be helping other kids in foster care understand they matter. And you'll be helping people understand the real cost of racism in science. Not just the injustice to individual scientists, but the lost knowledge that could have helped everyone." Maya thought about that. She thought about the other kids at the wilderness camp who had been neglected and endangered. She thought about the 5 years she had spent feeling invisible and worthless in the foster system. She thought about her grandfather, who had fought to preserve truth, even knowing he might not live to see it recognized. "I'll do one interview," Maya decided. "Just one, and I want to talk about all of it. The research, the racism, the foster system, everything." The interview ran on NPR 3 days later. Maya spoke clearly and honestly about running away from the wilderness camp, about finding the tent and the documents, about learning that she came from a scientist whose work had been suppressed because of his race. "My grandfather wrote that he wanted his family to know they came from people who refused to be invisible," Maya said. "For 5 years in foster care, I felt invisible. I felt like I didn't matter to anyone. But finding his research made me understand that I come from people who mattered, who did important work, who fought for truth. And that changed how I see myself. The response was overwhelming. Other foster youth reached out, sharing their own stories. Scientists contacted Dr. Williams, offering to help digitize and analyze Dr. Freeman's data. The Alaska Attorney General's office announced criminal charges against Peterson's wilderness camp for child endangerment. And most importantly, 2 weeks after Maya found the tent at 76 degrees of Brighamfo, Carol Jenkins called with news. The kinship placement is approved. You can go home with your uncle. 6 months after Maya Freeman walked into Killing Cold and found her grandfather's hidden legacy, she stood in the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., looking at an exhibition that bore her family's name. The Freeman Arctic Research Initiative, Climate Science and Racial Justice in 1950s America, occupied an entire gallery. Display cases held Dr. James Freeman's original journals, his scientific instruments, and the photographs Maya had found in that frozen tent. Digital screens showed his climate data overlaid with modern measurements, making the acceleration of Arctic warming impossible to ignore. And on the main wall, enlarged to life-size, was the photograph of the research team: Dr. Freeman, Dr. Chen, Mr. Matthews, Dr. Morrison, and Mr. Chang, standing proudly in front of their tent, their faces showing the determination of people who knew their work mattered even if the world refused to acknowledge it. But what made Maya's throat tighten with emotion was the second photograph mounted beside it, taken just last month. It showed Maya, Thomas, Dr. Williams, Ranger Clark, and Raymond Nicolai standing in that same location, in front of the restored research tent that was now a protected historical site. 3 generations separated the 2 photographs, but the legacy connected them. "It's strange, isn't it?" Thomas said softly, standing beside her. "Seeing our family story displayed like this, making something private into something public." "Grandpa James wanted it to be public," Maya replied. "That's why he hid the research instead of destroying it. He wanted someone to find it and tell the truth." The exhibition had opened 3 days ago to significant media attention. The New York Times had run a feature story. Scientists from around the world had traveled to see Dr. Freeman's original data. And most gratifyingly, the National Science Foundation had issued a formal apology for the suppression of his research and announced new initiatives to examine how racism had shaped scientific knowledge, or prevented it, throughout American history. But for Maya, the most meaningful moment had been earlier that day, at a small private ceremony before the museum opened to the public. The American Meteorological Society had posthumously awarded Dr. James Freeman their highest honor, recognizing his pioneering climate research. Thomas had accepted on his father's behalf, his voice breaking as he spoke about a son who had grown up watching his father's brilliance go unrecognized, who had carried that pain his whole life. "I wish Daniel could have seen this," Thomas had said, tears streaming down his face. "I wish he could have known that Dad's work would finally be acknowledged, that the truth would come out. Maybe if he'd known it was possible, he wouldn't have been so angry. Maybe we wouldn't have lost so many years." Maya had stood beside him, holding the letter Dr. Freeman had written, the one that had started everything, and she had read part of it aloud to the gathered scientists and historians. "If you find this, please know that we were here. We did this work. We mattered." My grandfather wrote those words in 1958, hoping someone would listen. It took 67 years, but someone finally did. And I'm standing here today because he never stopped believing that the truth was worth preserving, even when everything else was taken from him. Now, As museum visitors moved through the gallery, Maya watched them stop at different displays. A young black girl, maybe 10 years old, stood transfixed in front of Dr. Freeman's photograph. Her mother read the accompanying text aloud. Dr. James Freeman was one of the first black climatologists to work in Arctic conditions. His research documented early signs of climate change decades before the scientific community acknowledged the phenomenon. His work was suppressed due to racial discrimination, and his findings were lost for over 60 years. The girl looked up at her mother. He was a scientist? A black scientist in the 1950s? Yes, baby. And his granddaughter is the one who found his research and made sure everyone knew the truth. The girl turned and saw Maya standing nearby. Are you her? Are you the granddaughter? Maya nodded, suddenly shy. That's so cool, the girl said with genuine awe. You're like a detective. You found hidden treasure. But it wasn't gold. It was truth. That's exactly right, Maya said, smiling. And truth is more valuable than gold. After the girl and her mother moved on, Thomas put his arm around Maya's shoulders. You doing okay? I know this has been overwhelming. I'm good, Maya said, and realized she meant it. It's weird, but good. 6 months ago, I was nobody. Just another foster kid that nobody wanted. And now you're still you, Thomas interrupted gently. You were always somebody, Maya. You just didn't have people around you who helped you see it. But finding Grandpa's research didn't make you matter. You mattered already. The research just helped you understand that you come from people who fought to matter, to be seen, to tell the truth, even when it was dangerous. Maya leaned against her uncle, and it still felt strange to have an uncle, to have family, to have someone who wanted her not because they were paid to or because they had to, but because she was his brother's daughter, and that was enough. She had been living with Thomas in Baltimore for 4 months now, attending a good school, seeing a therapist who specialized in foster care trauma, slowly learning what it felt like to have stability and safety. It wasn't perfect. She still had nightmares about the cold, about running through snow with adult voices shouting behind her. She still had moments of panic when Thomas was late coming home, convinced he would disappear like everyone else had. She still struggled to believe that this placement wouldn't end, that she wouldn't be moved again, that she was allowed to put down roots. But it was getting better. And she had something now that she'd never had before. A sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than herself, a story that gave meaning to her suffering. Dr. Williams approached them, accompanied by a young woman in her 20s wearing a graduate student badge. Maya, this is Jennifer Park. She's a doctoral student at Columbia studying the history of science. She'd like to interview you for her dissertation on how scientific knowledge has been shaped by racism and suppression. Maya had gotten used to these requests. Historians, journalists, filmmakers, all wanting to document the story of the lost research and its recovery. She usually said yes, understanding that each interview helped ensure her grandfather's story was told and retold, becoming part of the historical record in a way that could never be erased again. Sure, Maya said. But can I ask you something first? Of course, Jennifer said. Why does this matter to you? The research. I mean, what made you want to study it? Jennifer smiled. Because I'm a Korean-American woman in STEM, and I know that people who look like me, people who aren't white men, have always contributed to science, but our contributions have often been erased or minimized. Your grandfather's story is important not just because his research was groundbreaking, but because it shows the cost of that erasure. We lost 60 years of climate data because the scientific establishment couldn't accept that a black man might know something they didn't. That's not just an injustice. It's a catastrophic loss of knowledge that we're all paying for now. Maya nodded. That's what Dr. Williams says, that racism doesn't just hurt the people it targets, it hurts everyone by destroying knowledge and preventing progress. Exactly, Jennifer agreed. So when I tell your story, I'm not just telling a story about one family. I'm telling a story about what we lose as a society when we let prejudice determine whose knowledge matters. As they talked, Maya noticed Peterson across the gallery. He was standing near the exit, looking at the exhibition with an expression she couldn't quite read. Their eyes met for a moment, and he looked away quickly, leaving without approaching. "What's he doing here?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with anger. "Probably seeing what he lost," Ranger Clark said, joining their group. She had flown in from Alaska for the opening. The case against his wilderness camp is proceeding. Multiple charges, multiple victims coming forward. His lawyer tried to get the charges reduced, but the state's going hard. He's looking at serious prison time. "Good," Maya said flatly. Then, surprising herself, she added, "But also, I almost feel sorry for him." He saw something valuable and thought the only thing to do was take it and profit from it. He couldn't imagine that there might be more important things than money, like truth or justice or honoring the people who did the work. Thomas looked at her with pride. "That's very mature of you." "Maybe," Maya said. "Or maybe I just understand now that holding on to anger just hurts me. Grandpa James must have been angry about what they did to him, about having his work stolen and suppressed. But he didn't let that anger stop him from hiding the research, from leaving that letter, from believing that someday the truth would matter. He turned his anger into purpose. And that's what I want to do, too." As the afternoon wore on, and more visitors moved through the gallery, Maya found herself returning again and again to that enlarged photograph of her grandfather, Dr. James Freeman, standing in the brutal Alaska cold, surrounded by scientific equipment, his face serious and determined, his posture speaking of dignity and quiet strength. She thought about the letter he had written, about his hope that someone in his family would find his work, and know that they came from people who refused to be invisible. She thought about how she had been invisible for so much of her life, in foster homes, in group facilities, at the wilderness camp, and how finding his research had somehow made her visible, not just to others, but to herself. "Thank you," Maya whispered to the photograph. "Thank you for hiding the truth where I could find it. Thank you for believing it mattered. Thank you for teaching me that I matter too." Thomas found her there as the museum was closing. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home. Maya tested the word in her mind, finding that it no longer felt foreign or frightening. Home was Thomas's house in Baltimore with her own room and her own things. Home was a place where she belonged, where she was wanted, where she could grow and heal and become whoever she was meant to be. "Yeah," Maya said, "I'm ready." As they walked out of the museum into the spring evening, Maya looked back one more time at the gallery bearing her family's name. The exhibition would travel to other museums after this: Anchorage, Seattle, Atlanta, Baltimore, telling the story of Dr. James Freeman and his suppressed research to thousands of people across the country. But for Maya, the most important discovery wasn't the scientific data or the historical significance. It was simpler and more profound. The discovery that she came from people who fought for truth, who refused to be erased, who believed that knowledge and justice were worth protecting even at great personal cost. She had walked into a tent at 76 degrees looking for nothing more than survival. And she had found her family's legacy, her own purpose, and proof that even in the coldest, most hostile places, truth could be preserved, waiting for the right person at the right time to bring it back into the light. Would you like to see the continuation of this story and uncover the other secrets hidden in these lands? Leave a comment, share this video, and stay tuned, because the next mystery may be even bigger.